That has left me to introduce representatives of my former and current employer, no awkwardness here. It's great to see Christine Shipton, Vice President of Original Content from Shaw Media, great supporter of my documentaries when I was at Shaw. And my new colleague, Mirko Bibic, he's the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Regulatory Affairs at Bell. And we're going to pick up where we have been handed a plateful of interesting discussion. So I thought I'd start with just looking back quickly with the past year, because when we were here last year, of course, Bell had just started to acquire CTV, and Shaw had just begun its transition with Global. So as you look back just in the last year, what wins do you think you had, and what are the challenges of all that integration that's been going on inside your companies the past year? I'll start with Christine, I guess.
It's such a big question. It depends on what slice we're looking at. You know, the year has been a huge year for Shaw Media. We're not in the process of being integrated anymore. We are integrated. It's been almost really 14, 15 months. You know, it was a challenging year no matter what, no matter who was going to buy us as CanWest. We had a lot of things to pick up our socks about, get it together, coming out of CCAA, all of that. And the year has been a huge year in sense of the security of Shaw as our owners, the conversations we're having with Shaw as a broadcast division, Shaw Media, suddenly talking to the cable division, the Shaw Direct division. And it's been fascinating to have us all in the room sort of saying, you do what? What do you do? Let me tell you what I do. And the good news is the conversations are happening. So we're fueled with sort of anything is possible. Even if I listened to Robert this morning about technology and devices and platforms, we're poised as a company, if we can keep talking to each other, to have great successes in that. I mean, the year's a great year. This fall has been wonderful. We're 5 of the top 10 specialty channels. Our ratings are holding on Global, which we think is a win right now, given this environment. So it's a good year.
Okay, Mirko?
Much of the same. Certainly, at the primetime conference last year, around the same time, we're probably headed towards, can't remember the exact time, it probably headed towards a regulatory hearing to get approval to acquire CTV, and that happened. So obviously the acquisition of Bell Media was a huge, huge highlight in 2011 for BCE and for Bell. That would be the top highlight. From that comes, of course, the task of integrating, as was mentioned with Shaw, and I think we've done a wonderful job there as well, just in terms of the look and the feel and the branding. It feels like it was done, executed at a top-notch level. We're having the same kinds of discussions internally and trying to seed the best ideas across all elements of the organization, which is really invigorating. For me, it's been a personal highlight as well, because I then get dropped into this industry, or look at, obviously I was involved in the broadcasting side, but from the BDU side of things, the satellite TV side of things, and now I'm looking at it from the broadcaster programmer side of things. So it's been a huge learning curve and exciting. So that would be kind of the business / regulatory highlight. Other business highlights, we took over on April 1 in terms of having a merged entity, and then got to the business of signing renewal affiliation deals with our BDU customers across the country, and I think met with a lot of success on that from the Bell Media side, and have almost all cable and satellite companies signed up, which is a great business win. There is a challenge to it because there are 4 or 5 where we don't have deals with, and unfortunately we have to go to the commission on those, and that will get resolved very shortly. But that's kind of the challenging side of the opportunity and the wins on the other side. And finally, I think just on the programming, because ultimately we're here to serve the viewer, and that's what the business is about, and our content. And we've had a lot of great positives. Flashpoint was mentioned by Peter. It continues to stand shoulder to shoulder with the best of US scripted drama. We're averaging, I think it's about 1.5 million viewers over 4 years, so that's phenomenal. And this morning there was an announcement, I believe, that Saving Hope is going to be picked up by NBC, and that will premiere later this year on CTV. LA Complex, Much Music show that's got picked up by CW, and there's a whole number of other programming and production wins that we're really pumped about. And I just mentioned, of course, a few independent productions that are Canadian and that have met with a lot of success. So that's really positive.
So it's interesting. I mean, as you talk, we are all, if we were on the content side, we're having to learn about the distribution side. If we were on the distribution side, we're having to learn about the content side. That kind of is the state of the industry right now. And probably breaking down the silos, which just sounds like what Robert says we have to start thinking about.
But can I add one thing? I think, you know, we had viewed ourselves as joining the Shaw world as, oh, they're adding a broadcast unit, and we were sort of the add-on to what was going on with the big Shaw world. And not that we're taking credit for this, or Paul Robertson's taking credit for this, but adding us into their family has created more conversations within the family that already existed. Like that, which I find fascinating, because they're realizing the opportunities that they hadn't even been discussing because they didn't have an arm of us. So
which we're obviously going to have to get better at as time goes on.
On the Bell, on the Bell side, what was interesting is if you look at the Bell Media executive team, you have kind of a great match, I think, of the best of the talent that was there before, and a number of folks from Bell who joined the Bell Media leadership team, including the president, Kevin Kroll. So right there you had kind of right away, you could have discussions about marrying the broadcasting culture with the BCE culture and do it in an instantly collaborative way without having a unit here that's forced to go talk to a separate unit here and try to figure out what their cultures are.
And negotiate it.
Yeah.
So let's talk with what...
That's another whole discussion, the word
Absolutely.
culture. But it was,
Let's move
approach.
Yeah. Let's move to what Peter Grant just shared with the group here, and that's the decision from the CRTC. I guess that was in July. So, I mean, most of us, most of you, I guess, have had a chance to sort of look at it, absorb it, think about it. Too late for this current season of television, but you're probably at the positions now where you're starting to think about next year as well. So let's give you an opportunity, first of all, to respond to what Mr. Grant provided here, some of his numbers, and I guess his overall thesis, which is that for the independent producers in the room, it's going to mean a significant increase in the amount of Canadian drama that is funded in Canada. And Christine, this is sort of in your wheelhouse primarily, I guess.
So, yes.
Good news.
I mean, like, everything Peter said is true. I also had a chance to look at Peter's paper and some of the footnotes. I actually think you were missing a couple $1 million, Peter, believe it or not, because I'm not sure you counted the Can West benefits. You only counted the Shaw benefits in PNI. But yeah, there's going to be, and continue to be for at least 5 years, a wealth of activity and licensing in those categories of programming. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how have you, at Shaw, how has that affected your thinking about the next 5 years?
Well, let me step back. The group licensing, as part of our renewals, actually affected our fiscal 11 year. And when the decision came, most of our decision-making for fiscal 11 had already been made. So, I mean, we could do some tweaks and use the flexibility of that. But really, as we entered fiscal 12, which we're in right now, we were really able to really dig in, get our heads around, what does this mean? What has the Commission allowed us to do here? And that's been a fascinating process. And I don't think we're even as deep as we can go yet. I think we're going to go even deeper in fiscal 13. And really what it meant for us, I mean, we have to be cognizant of the exhibition hours. Nobody's suddenly saying, okay, we've got $150 million, let's just spend it all on Showcase, you know, and not spend it on Slice or food or HGTV. I mean, we have to be cognizant of the success of our channels, the exhibition requirements. There's a percentage of the broadcast day on all of our channels that needs to be Canadian, and it needs to be quality Canadian. So there's no sense of massive swings. But what it's allowed us to do is really think about special projects. And special projects we think are going to have huge impacts. Or actually even beyond that, it's allowed us to say which channel, especially on our specialty roster, needs a huge boost. Which one is flattened out? Which, you know, and in terms of, and how important is that channel to us? So, for example, last year in fiscal 11, you wouldn't have noticed this as a producer or even as an audience. We actually spent more on Food Network and HGTV and a little less in certain other areas because they needed it. HGTV and it's proven successful, is now the #1 specialty channel for women above TSN, which is a first, because TSN always takes #1 in women because just of the mass audience that they have. And I think that's partly because of our strategic efforts with the group licensing and the flexibility allowed for us. So that's sort of ongoing, and as we look at our programming choices for not only that we've made for 12, but we're now making for 13, we have that flexibility. The P&I element of that is just a part of it. It's a factor. Here's the amount we will spend. And I'm going to be fascinated to have Peter do a paper, maybe next year or the next year after that, to look at what we actually all did spend. As I pointed out to Peter in a note, you know, we have 2 specialty channels, History and Showcase, that rely on P&I programming. You know, so there's no doubt we're going to spend our P&I, and I wonder if we're going to spend more. And I can't promise, I don't know. I got to look at all of that, but it may be the reality, because you need to do the right programming for those channels, let alone global. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah,
I'm giving you some perspective there.
You answered it right at the beginning, yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Which is probably good news. Now, the flexibility that the ruling provided, has Bell determined how real that is? What benefits that's giving the company?
So I think you touched on it, the flexibility a little bit just now. So generally speaking, I think Peter focused on the P&I aspects of the group licensing renewal policy, and for obvious reasons, given the nature of the conference. I think in terms of Peter's assessment on P&I, so I sometimes disagree with him, but more often than not, it's very hard to disagree with Peter. I think his assessment is fair. What I take from Peter's presentation, actually, if you look at the numbers especially, is that more than ever, the fortunes of the independent production community and the fortune of the private broadcasters are tied. Always been tied, but more than ever, they are tied. If there's success, and if there's programmer and broadcaster success, there ought to be and there will be independent production success. Of course, we have common cause. We both want to serve the viewer in order to achieve that success. So to that degree, I think that's what I took from Peter's half-an-hour talk. I would quibble with some aspects of it. So, I think at one point Peter said you'll see a dramatic rise in expenditures on P&I. That may be the case, of course. Whether there's a dramatic rise or not depends on revenues. And for the broadcaster, there's the specialty side of the business, and then there's the conventional side of the business. And for revenues to hit the targets that Peter projects in his note, and the projections weren't on the screen, but we saw the background numbers that he used to derive those projections. For specialty to hit the projections that Peter has, will require that specialty services continue to have packaging and revenue stability in order to be able to deliver those numbers. And that there's an open question about, there's some risk there. And part of it, much of it, is actually potentially regulatory in nature, with the Commission asking cable companies to explore further ways to provide consumers with flexibility. That inevitably will have an impact on affiliation deals and then on the revenues we're able to generate. So that's one aspect. On the conventional side, I don't see how the conventional segment will hit the numbers that Peter projects. He projects a constant...
Is that because of advertising?
Yeah, he projects a constant rise. We're not seeing it. In fact, we're seeing a drop. Conventional revenues, in our estimation, is still probably close to 10% below what it was pre-2008. There's been a drop Q4 to Q4, big drop. And so I'm not sure that we'll be able to hit the numbers that Peter projects. For that to happen, of course, there would be, and I can touch on this later, but dual revenue stream for conventional, which we can get into later. So that's one. Those are my high-level reflections on Peter. And then in terms of the flexibility, if you get into GLR decision, but beyond P&I only, I think one of the objectives and one of the goals and one of the things we were looking for certainly, and I think the ideal of going into that hearing was to find a way to maintain the core regulation that's necessary while providing the flexibility that operators always cherish and desire. And there's this notion of shifting spending across services. I think great ideal, great in concept. I think for us, it hasn't really turned out to be that much of an advantage. And the reason is it makes all good common sense. All our services want to provide the best product possible, and every service actually is spending the right way to deliver that value to the audience. So to say I'm going to starve you to overinvest in this other service, it's hard to do. And then on the conventional side, to take spending from conventional and move it to specialty, we still have exhibition requirements in place. Peter mentioned them. And the exhibition requirements continue to provide a limitation on how much flexibility you really have. So Peter said you can take all this money and focus on ratings now. You don't have to be so singularly focused on filling your schedule. That's partially true and not entirely correct at the same time, because you can't take an outrageous hypothetical. You can't take all your conventional spend and put it into the one gargantuan mega show that has never been produced in Canada, because you still have to fill up half your schedule in prime time with Canadian content. So you need to still make sure that you meet those exhibition requirements with high quality programming.
So I guess
I would add one thing that Peter really crystallized for us is that we're all in this together. And that's what this new policy has given us. Because and especially from my point of view, from content creation, Mirko comes at it a little bit differently. If we make great shows, you get more money in your pockets, because if the great shows produce ratings, in theory, our revenues will go up, and especially on specialty channels. And that just gives us more money to spend on the content. And it really is going to be that direct in my mind, from my point of view, and it's what I drill into my team every day.
So it sounds like you're both saying more money, maybe not the 50% increase, maybe not the 30% increase that were in the projections, but definitely better than it has been.
Well, it's going to ride the wave. It's all going to be relative. If we are successful, we're all successful. If we see a dip, we're all got to bite it. We got to bite the dip,
Now, I know there's going to be an opportunity, by the way, for Q&A just at the end of this. So if you hear things that you're interested in and that you want to ask them about, there will be that opportunity. I know, Mirko, you put together a little presentation that talks about some of the unknowns as you move forward and as you make these kinds of decisions about how much to invest, and it goes to your sort of expertise in this area, which is sort of the regulatory area, and some of those challenges are. Do you mind sharing that? It's just a short one, I think.
So, given that it was a panel to discuss the impacts of the GLR policy, thought we'd put together 4 or 5 slides just to set the context. Obviously, as I said, from our perspective, well, we all agree our fortunes are tied in this. And so what are the, I approach it from the perspective of, and we were going to have 4 panelists here when I prepared these. I was going to set a bit of context and we were going to have a bit of a debate about it, but came at it from the perspective of what are the drivers to the mutual success. Obviously, there's the viewer tastes, and viewer success is one of the key drivers. Technological change is a key driver, and we had a wonderful presentation this morning on that. Business strategies are a driver, but undeniably, regulatory and public policy is a key driver to success in the industry. We are heavily regulated. And I was going to focus, given the nature of the topic and what I do, on those regulatory drivers. And the point of the presentation was going to be GLR, great in concept. I'm repeating myself here, but it's not the panacea, and it's not the be-all and end-all that's going to assure that we have mutual success, because there are a whole bunch of other foundational regulatory issues that we grapple with every day that have a direct bearing on that mutual success. And the point of this, and I'll be quick because I don't want to turn this into a regulatory tirade or lecture, but just highlight some of the 4 or 5 issues from my perspective that I think are more important potentially than the GLR decision to ensure that the industry continues to grow and that we have this mutual success that I keep talking about. So the first slide was just to set that up. There's a whole bunch of issues around market predictability and regulatory predictability that I think are key drivers to success. Increased regulatory intervention, which we're seeing. Symmetry in the rules. I'm going to skip over the symmetry point because Peter did cover it. It's things like, these are Peter's words, not mine, Rogers dodged a bullet. The point there is, if there's a set of rules, there should be a common set of rules that apply to all stakeholders in the system. This way, everybody can operate under the same foundation and move forward, and then win or lose based on their programming choices, their business success, their business acumen. And then the last point is a little bit of the financial element that regulatory also drives. So very quickly, lack of predictability, and I know I speak on this one for Gary Mavera as well from Chorus, who's not here. But this was going to be one of the things that he was going to talk about as well. You know, the Commission was on a path in 2008, 2009 to do certain things, ease back on regulation, you know, deregulation of Category C services, sports and news is what that means, and keeping their mitts off of the internet was another one. And then Shaw bought Global, BCE bought CTV, Globe Media, and what happened, you know, those things were either entirely or partially reversed in terms of regulatory rulings, and it causes a lot of confusion, and I don't think we should underestimate the angst and the confusion and the disruption it causes for business people who made billion-dollar bets on the basis of a particular set of rules, expecting those to be the rules, and then having those reversed on them. And you know, these acquisitions, I think, were entirely predictable in 2008, that not too far down the road, this might happen. And in fact, I suspect that even within the Commission, they were predicting, maybe not who was going to acquire which broadcaster, but that that was going to happen. So, you know, I know and Chorus has their big 6 principles, and one of them is we need predictability in the regulatory environment. The next one is, I have it, excessive intervention. Again, it's not to be a tirade, but we need to accept and understand that with, you know, not only the Commission reversed some of the rulings they had, you know, recently implemented, but they added the vertical integration rules, which are, you know, a heavy set of rules that we all need to be cognizant of, and it affects everyone in this room. You know, there is a new media exemption order which basically says, or the thematic, you know, the theme of it is, Commission doesn't regulate the internet, which is more or less true, but it does get involved in rights issues and contractual rights as far as the exploitation of content on the internet and mobile and new media is concerned. It has done that. And just like there was a recent ruling, which actually pleasantly surprised, yesterday the Commission indicated it would step away from this issue, but there was a ruling in December that said that Bell Mobility's exclusive rights to NFL content was a violation of the rules and needed to be undone. And you know, the NFL got involved in that, saying, well, we're not prepared to give those rights to anyone else, and TELUS, who had filed the initial complaint, said, okay, fine, Bell's promised not to have exclusive deals in the future, so maybe we should let it rest, and the Commission confirmed yesterday that they would. So this ended up turning out okay, but the theme here is there is the potential for the Commission to get involved directly in rights. And so it could be the NFL's rights, or it could be your rights to your content when it's exploited on new media platforms. And I think we all should actually be a little bit concerned about that. Now, this one's turned out at the end of the day that it's not going to be an immediate disruption. It'll be a future disruption. But, you know, in the intervening period from December to March, make no mistake, it caused a lot of disruption internally at BCE, strained relationships with rights holders, and again, we shouldn't underestimate that. Jumping forward, again, talking about symmetry here. The point of this slide really is back to the financial issue, which I've already addressed, so I'm going to really skip over this very quickly. If you look at these, at the way content is exploited, you'll see, you know, Netflix or direct to consumer over new media platforms. There is obviously subscription revenue that Netflix generates. They can generate advertising revenue as well. Same thing with mobile TV. We charge the consumer directly. We can exploit advertising there. On specialty services, everyone in the room understands that we get subscriber revenue and we sell advertising. The only one where there's a big red X is for conventional TV. And just to end, back to fortunes are tied. If you look at some of these numbers, there's, you know, turned out to be very kind of, to me, interesting numbers here, where on the value of conventional TV, 10 years ago, it used to represent, those are the blue numbers here, it used to represent 29% of industry revenue and 24% of operating income. Whereas 10 years later, it still represents a fair chunk of industry revenue at 16%, yet only 3% of industry operating income. And again, that is a critical financial number to really assess whether P&I will continue to grow. Because if that continues and revenue stalls or dips, it's going to have an impact on everyone in the room. So I'm going to end there.
Okay, great. One last question, and it goes to Tursik's comments more than not, and it's perhaps a little provocative, but if our real challenge is against all of those brands that are out there, and if we are really in an era of free trading culture, are all of these regulations and the way that we're sort of operating and discussing here, is that a blessing or a curse if we're in a race for innovation? I'll just ask for Christine on that.
I certainly picked up on what Robert said about legislation versus innovation, and I actually think in Canada because of legislation, we have an opportunity, especially in, I'd say we've got about a 2-year window for huge innovation because of legislation. Like, you know, we have this legislation, we will be spending this money on content, and now we as an industry need to innovate in the world that Robert was talking to us about. I mean, we see the OTT, we see them as competitors at Shaw Media. We are being nimble. We're saying, how do we compete? We need to know our audience. We need to understand that they, you know, all those things, want it wherever, whenever, on whatever platform. We need to recognize they're doing 2 and 3 screens at once. We need to provide them with content that allows them to do that, that keeps them engaged. We have big consultants coming in and talking to us about social media and how to have that conversation with our audience. And at the heart of it, it still comes back to what is the content that we're all going to buy into to put into the space, whether it's on linear television, whether it's on VOD, web, streaming, like whatever it's going to be, we need to do that. And in the past, if you look at a project like Lost Girl on Showcase, where it has just ballooned into the social media and digital space in terms of what we're doing with that content and the core product, you know, but that's been an after the fact, and it's because of the cult following that it has been allowed to balloon into that space. We need to start from ground zero, and we're all saying this, but we need to be talking about it in our creative discussions so that we're thinking about it from day one. And it still comes back to what is the idea that we believe will engage our audiences. We've been doing this for years as broadcasters, thinking about our audience. How do we get them to want what we're offering? We just need to keep thinking about that in a much more broad sense, that they're going to want to engage in a lot of different ways with the content.
That's great.
That's what we're working on.
Let's open it up. We've got about 10 minutes here for questions if anybody has any. And if not, we'll have an early coffee. I'll recap this for people at the back of the room.
The new framework, you can now broadcast content on a number of platforms. And are you finding that that temptation in order to ensure that you're benefiting, getting maximum benefit, is endangering the brand of individual stations like Showcase or Space Bravo? Is that temptation to cross broadcast leading to opportunities, or are you finding that in fact you're still tending to silo in order to show specific data?
So the question for the back of the room is some of this experimentation in new media, are you finding that it is savaging your business model for broadcast or starting to assist it?
I think it's just a brand discussion period, that the brands are becoming the content. I was going to say shows, but it's not just shows, it's the content. And sometimes it's the characters that are the brand. You know, like look at A&E recently, that whole channel is Storage Wars. Like if you actually look at the schedule, how often it's repeated, and what's driving their ratings, it is Storage Wars. That has become its own brand in terms of what it is. And we talk a lot with our marketing people about this when we go to our specialty, because you know they were built on brands, environments, and we've had to help our marketing people come out of that and understanding that it isn't the environment anymore. It is the shows themselves and or the characters that are represented in the shows that are going to push actually the channel brand forward. But first and foremost, it needs to be the content brand.
And I know
think that's what you're asking, Tom.
In news, I know we've discovered that,
yes.
that there's a direct relationship between social media interaction on Twitter
yeah.
and news ratings. That if there's a car chase going on and people are tweeting, they understand who owns that story, and then that translates to the news brand.
But there's still in news, sorry Mirko, there still is that trust and credibility factor that it's hard to break audiences away from. You know, who they go to first to be in that space. Anyways.
Very true.
And we haven't found that it's savaging the brands at all. In fact, it's enhancing them. And so what you're doing is you start with, you have the brand, the specialty service, the channel, whether it's news, unconventional, et cetera, and then you're expanding and enhancing the value of that brand and the value of what you're delivering to the viewer by exploiting it across multiple platforms. And then, from taking off my broadcasting hat and putting my communications hat in kind of the BCE strategy, it was, okay, we have all these multiple networks and these multiple pipes, and we want to deliver content to the viewer across all these screens. And so, those two married quite well. And it wasn't really about, it's not the regulatory flexibility of GLR, because I think there was a little bit of an element of that to your question that's, provoked this or promoted this. It was just kind of the business strategy or the business desire to hit as many eyeballs as possible across multiple screens. And then how do you do that? You take your brands and you leverage them and extend them.
And begin the chatter. I mean, people are using that kind of talk in the office. How do we begin and build the chatter around what it is we're about to offer? Does that mean, as some of the U.S. services are doing, and we're looking at releasing the programming online first for whatever purpose with a strategy, but we use that kind of language.
And that's Kevin, what you do basically every single day, right?
Yeah.
And how am I going to leverage this into the digital media screens and vice versa?
They moved a long way, I got to say, in a short amount of time. Any other questions? Yes.
Christine, when you're talking about P&I and the specialty channels, a lot of those specialty channels are now rivaling conventional numbers, and some of them have opportunities for scripted programming to go on them. Mm-hmm. Do you see some P&I being spent on your specialties other than Showcase, like history?
Well, history takes a huge bulk of P&I expenditure. This year alone, we're doing approximately 120 hours of documentaries, and it takes a huge amount. But you will see, I think, more drama production on history. We were a partner on the Kennedys, which was driven by the History US, and it was an interesting experiment for us to put drama with that much emphasis on history. I think you'll see some of that, yes.
Interesting. For Bell Media, in terms of our overall P&I bucket, 60% is directed towards specialty, 40% conventional.
Yeah.
So, and they're big numbers, as Peter mentioned, and he wasn't too far off in terms of what they are.
The other thing I'd point out was that there was a new definition of documentary this year. I know that we had to get our heads around some of the differences between the new category of 11B versus an O2B documentary, and it's the Commission narrowing the definition to ensure that the documentaries are documentaries and that they're in sync with the CMF definitions of documentaries. And it's really addressing what we call factual entertainment, where there is a contrived sensibility to the original concept, and we know that those kinds of shows do extremely well in ratings. I wouldn't even call them reality television, but there's a contrivance to them that draws eyeballs. So we're dealing with sort of three categories of the unscripted world now too. So it's just another little wrinkle that got put in.
Last question there, sir.
Thanks. Hi. Peter Miller. I'm struck by the contrast between the changing, incredible disruption of Robert's description of the world over the next 5 years and Peter Grant's "the land is strong, our revenues are growing, and P&I will grow along with it." And you touched on it a little bit, Mirko. It's an area that I spent a little bit of time thinking about. You commented, Mirko, on the declines in conventional. When you look at those YouTube channels and you look at what Canadians would be able to access via internet TV in the next 5 years and how they could compete with a Food Network and an HGTV, you start to see the picture of a declining specialty sector in this 5-year period. So I guess my question is, from where you sit, what are the odds that we'll be seeing less P&I in 5 years and not more P&I when you look at that environment and the challenges we're facing?
I think so So, Peter, that's a big question. I could.
5 years seems like 100
Yeah,
years.
well, it's also, I have kind of a lot of thoughts on Robert's presentation from this morning, and I don't have the time to get into it. But for now, what we're seeing is a complementarity between kind of the traditional viewing and the new media viewing. And so if you look out 3 years, I think Peter's projections are probably close to right. We can't be sticking our heads in the sand and pretend that this can necessarily last forever, and we can't avoid innovation, obviously, because clearly the consumer wants convenience, flexibility, viewing at any time. I think there were a couple of stark dichotomies expressed this morning, and I think part of it was probably a presentation tool. You set up one polar end and then you create the other polar end to kind of show the stark contrast and kind of jar the audience into thinking about these thought-provoking things. I don't think it's that stark as one versus the other. It was a phenomenal presentation, but for example, the notion that what's ailing the traditional incumbent world is that we have an over-reliance on rights, an over-reliance on laws and legislation, and an over-reliance on scheduling. True, but then if you look at the modern picture painted of what the Googles and the Apples are doing, obviously they're doing the same thing. They're relying on underlying rights. They're bringing people into their world, and then they're using that proprietary knowledge to do what they want. They're not scheduling in the traditional sense, but they're curating for you to make life easier. So, a lot of it of the old world is being transposed in the new world, but in a completely innovative format and catering to the convenience. And we're going to have to go there. I also take issue with the notion that only disruptive innovation is good. It's clearly we've got to watch out for it. Sustaining innovation is good too. So these dichotomies I could talk about. But Peter, to your direct question, there is a risk there, and it's going to be managed, and we can't hide our heads in the sand and pretend it's not going to happen. But for now, it is complementary, and in fact, it's enhancing traditional viewing.
But I also love the idea that, as Peter said, that our companies will be just another app, that people can download. Yeah. And that'll still come back to who's curating, aggregating, and offering the content that people want. So that's what we have to work towards.
Christine, Mirko, thanks very much, and thank you for your
everybody.
attention, folks.